In Module 1, Lesson 5, we were working on writing decimals in word form, standard form, and expanded form. First, let's start with word form. Word form is basically like it sounds. You are writing numbers in words. So for example, if we had the number 10, word form would be written as 10. But our objective is to write decimals in word form. So what if we had the decimal 0.124? First, I like to insert that number into my place value chart. So here's my decimal, and I have 1, 2, and 4. When you are saying in word form, you always want to look at the very last number in the decimals. Okay, and the last number in the decimals is in the thousandths place, which means that our number is going to be categorized as thousandths. So this would be 124 thousandths. So you count the number, or you say the number from left to right, and you add on that last column at the end. So let's take a look at one of the questions on your homework. This is question 2B. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to write this number. I think about it in my place value chart. I see my decimals right here. So I want to see what do I have before or to the left of my decimal, and what do I have to the right of my decimal. To the left of my decimal, I have 15, so I'm going to fill that in. I have 1 10 and 5 ones. Then to the right of my decimal, I have 0 6 2. So I'll fill that in 0 6 2. Now, I start here when I'm writing, and that would be 15. So I would write 15 on my line. Then to represent the decimal, right here, because I have 15 and a decimal, the decimal is represented in word form with the word and. So down here on my line, I would have 15 and. So far I have 15 and now I'm going to go to what I have to the right of my decimal. And just like here, I'm going to go to the furthest column to the right, and I'm going to see what column it's in, and it's in thousandths. So I know down here, I'm going to classify this number as thousandths. Now I want to figure out what goes in this space, because I have 15 and something thousandths, because that last column is here. And so I look at this number. I have 0 6 2, and I just read it normally. The 0, we wouldn't say anything, so I have 62. So the 62 would go down here in that spot. So my number here in answer 2B, how I would say that in word form, is 15 and 62 thousandths. The next form we're going to talk about is standard form. And standard form is what most of us are used to seeing in math, and it's just writing using numbers. So if I had 20, the standard form would be 20 or 20. So let's take it and make it a little bit harder where we're working in decimals. Here I have 5 thousandths. Now my first clue is that thousandths, because that tells me how far I'm going to go over in my column, and that is this column right here. Now what I do is I actually fill in my numbers kind of going backwards from right to left, and I have the number 5 here, so I start 5, and I don't have any other numbers, so I have to fill those columns in with zeros, and my decimal goes right here. So 5 thousandths would be written as 0 0 5, or 0.005. Another way that I like to think about this if I'm not having access to a place value chart is I look at this last thousandths and I ask myself, how many place values past my 0 or past my decimal is thousandths? And it's 1, so tenths, hundredths, thousands, and I draw a line for each place value. And then same idea here, you start kind of going backwards, and you start at the right, and you fill in those numbers, and that number's 5, so I would start here, 5, and I have some empty spaces, so I would do a 0. And I end up again with 0.005. Let's take a look at this number. I have 25 hundredths. I look for that decimal name, hundredths, so I know my column is going to be the hundredths column. That's my last column. And then I take a look at the number 25. Okay, I have a 2, 5, and I start filling in that number going backwards in this hundredths column. So my first number here going backwards is 5. So I place that in the hundredths column, and then I keep moving to the left, and my next number is 2. So that goes here. I'm at my decimal, and then I don't have any more numbers after the 2. So 25 hundredths would be written as 0.25. Now the other way, if you don't have access to the place value chart, is you draw your decimal, and you're going to draw lines to represent the place values. I'm at hundredths, and I know that that is 2 place values to the right, so I have tenths, hundredths place value, and then I fill in my numbers same way. I start with my 5, and I go backwards and 2. Same answer, 2 different strategies. So let's take a look at one of our homework problems. I'm looking at problem 1, letter C, and it wants us to write this word form into standard number form. So it says 9 and 235. Now there's 2 clue words here that we talked about in word form and in standard form, and. This word and signifies that I am going to have a decimal. So I'm going to put that here to remind myself. And now I'm going to look to the left, and this is what's going to be to the left of the decimal, and that's the number 9, and it goes in the ones column. Okay. Now I'm going to look at what goes to the left of my decimal, and the first word that I'm going to look for that's going to give me a clue is where I'm going to go to in my decimal place value, and that clue word is thousandths. So I know that I'm going to go and start here in this thousandths column, or my number is going to go all the way to that thousandths column. Now I want to look at what number I have here. It's 235. So I'm just going to write it out, 235. And then I'm going to fill that in starting with this last number and kind of go backwards. So the 5, then I go backwards to the 3, and then finally I go backwards to the 2, and I've reached my decimal. So this number, 9 and 235 thousandths, is written as 9.235. Now, again, like we did up here, if you don't have access to a place value chart, similar strategy, I just like to draw lines. So I know that I have an and here, so I know I'm going to have a decimal. What goes in front of my decimal is 9. My clue word thousandths tells me that I'm going to have 3 place values, so tenths, hundredths, and thousandths. And then I fill in going backwards, 5, 3, and 2. Same number, 2 different strategies. Finally, we'll get to expanded form. In expanded form, the definition is just showing how much each digit in a number is worth. So if we take our example 543, I'm breaking down each of these digits into their place value. The 5 is in the hundredths place value, so it's worth 500. The 4 is in the tens place value, so it's worth 40. The 3 is in the ones place value, so it is worth 3. Now let's take it a next step and even decompose it further by showing how many copies of each place value I have. So I would ask myself, this is the place value of 100, so I'd ask myself, how many copies of 100 do I have? And I have 5 copies. So I have 5 times 100. Then I move on to my next number, and I'm adding that together. The addition signs stay the same. Then I ask myself, how many copies of 10 do I have? And I have 4. So I would say that 4 copies of 10. And my final number is in the ones place value. So I'm asking myself, how many copies of 1 do I have? And here I have 3 copies of 1. So I would write that as 3 copies of 1. So what you're finding is these multiplication signs really mean how many copies of something that you have. All right, so now let's move on to decimals. I have here 0.78 or 78 hundredths, and I want to write that in expanded form. But first, let's take a look at, on my hundreds chart, what each of these columns is worth. So the ones is worth 1, tens is tens, and 100 is 100. But on the decimal side, tenths is 0.1, hundredths is 0.001, sorry, it is 0.01, and then thousandths is 0.001. We can also write these in fractional form, and tenths would be 1 over 10. Hundredths would be 1 over 100. And thousandths would be 1 over 1,000. All right, so let's take a look down here, 0.78. I'm just going to put it in my place value chart. Okay, and I'm just going to ask myself, okay, I'm going to start here, and that's 7. I have 7 copies, and it is in the tenths place value, so I have 7 copies of tenths. And then I add my next number, which is 8, and so that is 8 copies of hundredths, because it is in the hundredths place value, 0.01. And if I wanted to rewrite this using fractions, I would use these fractions right here, and it would look something like this. 7 times 1 over 10 plus 8 times 1 over 100. Now let's take a look at a homework number. I'm looking at problem 3, number or letter B, and it's 0.362. The first thing that I'm going to do is put that on my place value chart. And since I didn't have enough room, I just wrote it underneath. Then I'm going to start here at the left and ask myself, how many copies of tenths do I have? And I have 3 copies, and the value of those copies in the tenths is 0.1. Then I'd move to my next number in the hundredths column, and I'd ask myself, how many copies of 100ths do I have? And I have 6 copies of 100ths, which would be 6 times 0.01. And my last column, I would ask myself, how many copies of thousandths do I have? And I have 2 copies of thousandths, which would be 2 times 0.001. Now to write in fractions, I still have my same number of copies. I'm just replacing my decimals with my fractions up here, so it would look something like this. 3 times 1/10 plus 6 times 100th plus 2 times 1,000th.